Jordan froze as Officer Collins's hand tightened on his shoulder. "Watch your tone, boy," Collins hissed. Then the door slammed open. His father stood there, flanked by 4 men in uniform, eyes cold as steel. "Let him go," his father growled. What happened next left the whole school in stunned silence. But let's start from the beginning. Jordan Miller sat frozen as Officer Collins's hand dug into his arm, the cold bite of the man's fingers pressing through his sleeve. His heart hammered against his ribs, loud enough that it filled his ears. He could feel the heat of a dozen eyes boring into him, the quiet gasps of his classmates sharpening the weight of his humiliation. His cheeks burned, his fists curling at his sides as Collins's grip tightened. His breathing grew shallow, but he forced himself to stay calm. He'd learned that from his dad. Never show weakness in front of a predator. Collins loomed over him, his tall, muscular frame blocking the classroom door. His eyes were cold, hard. "I said take off the hoodie," he growled, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a blade. Jordan hesitated. He knew the dress code. There was nothing wrong with a hoodie. But he also knew the look in Collins's eyes. This wasn't about the dress code. This was about power. Jordan's hand instinctively lifted to his hoodie's collar, but then he stopped. "It's not against the dress code," he said, his voice low but steady. He had barely gotten the words out before Collins stepped toward him. "Excuse me?" Collins's mouth curled into a sneer. Without warning, he grabbed the hoodie's hood and yanked it down hard. Jordan stumbled back, his head snapping forward. A sharp sting lit up the back of his neck as he caught his balance. His eyes darted toward his classmates, wide-eyed and frozen, but no one moved. No one even breathed. "Don't talk back to me, boy." Collins' voice was low, dangerous. Jordan's fists curled tighter. His breath quickened. His chest rose and fell with the heat of his growing anger. But he forced himself to stay still. His father had always taught him to pick his battles. "Stand up," Collins ordered. Jordan's jaw tightened. He didn't move. His legs felt heavy, his feet glued to the floor. "I said, stand up," Collins barked louder. Slowly, Jordan pushed himself to his feet, his eyes locking onto Collins's face. His body was rigid, his fists trembling at his sides. Collins's eyes darkened. He reached out, gripping Jordan's arm with bruising force and yanking him toward the door. "You think you're special?" Collins sneered, dragging him toward the hallway. "You're just another punk who thinks the rules don't apply to him." Jordan's heart pounded in his ears. He could feel Collins' grip tightening, the pressure digging into his skin. He bit down on the inside of his cheek to keep from wincing. He wouldn't give Collins the satisfaction. The classroom was so quiet it felt unnatural. His classmates stared, eyes wide, mouths slightly open, but no one moved. Even Ms. Robinson, his teacher, looked stunned. Her hands hovered near her chest as though she wanted to speak but didn't know how. "Where are you taking him?" Ms. Robinson's voice finally broke through the suffocating silence. "Principal's office," Collins snapped. "He needs to learn some respect." Jordan's breath shuddered. His vision blurred, but he forced himself not to cry. He wouldn't let Collins win. He wouldn't give him that power. His father had always told him, "Don't let them see you break." Collins pulled harder. Jordan stumbled forward as Collins's hand remained locked around his arm like a vice. Jordan's legs tensed. His pulse hammered in his ears. His throat tightened. He didn't know how this would end, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let Collins break him. Jordan sat stiffly in the school office chair, his back straight and his hands clenched together so tightly his knuckles were turning white. His breath was shallow, his chest tight. Collins stood behind him, arms crossed over his chest, looming like a shadow. The air felt thick, heavy with tension. Jordan could feel Collins's cold stare pressing into the back of his head. His shoulder still ached from the officer's grip, a dull throb pulsing under his skin. He wanted to rub it, but he refused to show weakness. "You know how many kids like you I've had to deal with?" Collins's voice was sharp, laced with contempt. "Always talking back. No respect for authority." Jordan's jaw tightened. He swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I wasn't talking back," he muttered. Collins's eyes darkened. His head tilted slightly. "What'd you say?" His hand shot out and gripped Jordan's shoulder hard enough to make him flinch. The pain radiated down his arm, sharp and immediate. "I said I wasn't talking back," Jordan repeated, his voice steady even as his muscles tensed under Collins's iron grip. Collins leaned down, his face so close that Jordan could feel his breath against his ear. "Watch your tone, boy." Jordan's breath hitched. His heart hammered so hard it felt like it might crack his ribs. His fists curled tighter in his lap, his fingernails digging into his palms. He could feel Collins's grip tightening on his shoulder, the pressure burning through his skin. His mouth went dry, and then the door slammed open. Eric Miller stood in the doorway, framed by 4 other men in military uniforms. Their broad shoulders and hard expressions filled the room like a wave crashing through it. The tension in the air sharpened to a cutting edge. The soldiers' eyes were sharp and cold, scanning the room with practiced precision. Collins's grip on Jordan's shoulder loosened, but his face twisted into an irritated sneer. "Who are you?" he scoffed, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I'm his father." Eric's voice was cold and precise, cutting through the tension like a blade. He stepped into the room, his boots clicking sharply against the tile floor. "And these are my team." Collins's eyes narrowed. "Sir, this is a school matter." Eric's gaze darkened. "Then explain why my son's shoulder is bruised." He stepped toward Collins, his shoulders squared. "And why you're putting your hands on him." Collins took a step back. His eyes flicked toward the other soldiers, who were standing like statues, their gazes hard and unyielding. His mouth twitched, his bravado starting to crack. "Your son was being disrespectful." Eric's jaw flexed. He stepped forward until he was chest to chest with Collins. His eyes were sharp, his expression carved from stone. "If you ever lay a hand on my son again, you'll regret it." Collins's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His eyes darted toward the other soldiers. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his jaw, gave Collins a hard, unblinking stare. "You have no idea who you're messing with," the man said quietly. Eric's gaze remained fixed on Collins. His voice dropped into a low, cutting register. "Apologize to my son." Collins' mouth twisted. His face flushed red. He hesitated. Now," Eric said. His tone left no room for argument. Collins' jaw tightened. He swallowed hard. His eyes flicked toward Jordan, then back to Eric. His face twisted with bitterness. "I apologize." Jordan's eyes widened. He could see the struggle in Collins's face, the way the word almost physically hurt to say. Collins's gaze burned with resentment. Eric didn't move. He stood completely still, his eyes fixed on Collins like a predator waiting for an opening. Slowly, Collins's shoulders dropped. The tension in the room began to lift, but the weight of what had just happened settled heavily on Jordan's chest. Collins stepped back, his face dark with anger and humiliation. Jordan's shoulder throbbed where Collins's hand had been, but for the first time since it started, he didn't feel small. He didn't feel weak. His father was standing in front of him, and behind him stood 4 men who had faced far worse than Collins. Collins backed away toward the door, his eyes still burning. Eric didn't take his eyes off him until Collins was gone. Only then did he turn toward Jordan, his eyes softening slightly. Jordan let out a shaky breath. His fists slowly unclenched. His father didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Eric just gave him a small nod, and Jordan sat up a little straighter. He wasn't alone anymore. A week later, Collins was gone. The school board had launched an investigation after Eric reported the incident. Several other students came forward about Collins's behavior. Jordan walked through the school hallway, hearing whispers from his classmates. "You okay, man?" his friend Tyler asked. "Yeah, I'm good." Jordan smiled faintly. He reached his locker, and there was Eric, waiting for him. "Ready to go?" Eric asked. Jordan nodded. "Yeah." Eric put a hand on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you." Jordan smiled wider. "Thanks, Dad." 2 months later, Jordan stood at a school assembly. "I never thought I'd be standing here," he began. "But after what happened, I realized that staying quiet isn't the answer." Eric watched from the back of the auditorium, arms crossed, a proud smile on his face. "Sometimes standing up for yourself means asking for help," Jordan said. "It means not letting fear win." The crowd clapped. "And it means knowing you're not alone." Jordan glanced toward his father and his dad's team, standing behind him like a wall of strength. Jordan smiled. "Thank you."